Okay, everybody, the next talk's about to start, so if you can take your seats, and if you can welcome Rob, who is going to talk about the past, present and future of the Hackney Society. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. My first point was actually going to be just that. This isn't a history of the Hackney Society, actually. This is very much about the Hackney Society's history and a kind of important element of it, its work around historic buildings and spaces within the borough. I've been a society member for but a few years. The society is almost 60 years old now. I've been a trustee not even 2 years, so I wasn't even aware of much of this happening that I'm going to be talking about, let alone present for it. So I've learnt a lot about my subject matter through the Society's publications, and these are works that burst with passion, with ideas and opinions about what should the future of Hackney should be like. And so, on that sort of opinionated front, I'm going to try and do something similar today when talking about Hackney's historic built environment, and not just the bits of it that are designated as being at risk, but a much broader conception of it as we find ourselves in a very changing and confusing world. Now, thank you for coming along for what is probably the longest, driest, most boring talk title in the entire programme. So I thought, give a little 21st century Hackney twist, and with all due apologies to the Hoxton Mini Press, I present to you an opinionated guide to Hackney's built heritage at risk. Lots of love for Hoxton Mini Press. Buy the books, they're great. So it's almost, as I said, almost 60 years since the establishment of the Hackney Society, and so my talk will start by reviewing the Hackney Society's work in the sphere of built heritage at risk since 1967 up until 2024. Including in that this year marks the 40th anniversary of an important Buildings at Risk survey completed by the Society. Much more on that later. It's almost a decade as well since our 50th anniversary publication, which marks the Society's most recent substantial published work relating to, a huge plethora of things, but many key aspects of the built environment, both historical and contemporary. So moving on from that, I'll look at the Buildings at Risk group. If I say BARG, I'm not pretending to be a pirate. This is just the short form that we use for Buildings at Risk group. Set up in 2024, 18 months running, thereabouts. And so just introduce you to a series of the cases that we look at and some of the other work that we do. I'll challenge you a little bit to think why we should be so interested in old buildings, old street furniture and so forth. You're at a history festival, so this is something of a gimme, but I think there's some bigger issues afoot that I want to touch upon. And then finally, say what else we've done outside of our monthly Zoom meetings and what we're going to be doing in the next few months as a group and as the Hackney Society more generally. So I want to take you back to the 11th of January 1967, and a letter was published that day in the Hackney Gazette, authored by Michael Thomas, and it's from that letter this phrase is taken. We shouldn't like people to think we are in favour of propping up old ruins. And there's two things to draw from this. First, the implication that the Hackney Society, as would become, was very much not going to be a historical society. It wasn't rooted in the past. It was a civic society, and as such, it would welcome well-designed new development as well. But also within that, I think you can detect a hint that there were a number of old ruins in Hackney to be propped up at that time. From there, things moved quickly. The first inaugural meeting of the Society was held on the 6th of February 1967, at which this draft constitution was presented for discussion. And you may note within that 3 out of the 5 objectives were either wholly or partly about the existing built environment. And the Constitution was tweaked and duly adopted, and this is when the version that was published in 1978. You'll notice that tacked onto it was a 6th aim, concerning to further society by means of meetings, exhibitions, lectures and publications, all of which are still integral to the Society's activities today. But except right from early doors, the Society was also playing a more activist, we could say, role in speaking out for the historic built environment of the borough. And it scored early successes on this front, up in Stoke Newington and the saving of Sandford Terrace, and over in the far west of Hoxton with Shepherdess Walk, both of which still are with us today and look truly marvellous. It wasn't fighting every fight there was to be picked. There were many battles to be fought at this time in Hackney. For one thing, this was a time of council policy of comprehensive residential redevelopment. Up to 95% of Hackney's extant housing stock was intended to be replaced with new housing, and also the idea of municipalisation of housing, so housing no longer as a private property but as a public one instead. So we find Hackney Society staying clear of the Save the Beaver campaign of the late 60s and early 70s, which sees much of de Beauvoir town still as it is today, but did play an active role in the Mapledene public inquiries, the area to the west of London Fields, in the 70s, and I believe Laurie Elk spoke about this at a previous Hackney History Festival. As if this residential redevelopment wasn't enough, there was also the notorious motorway box and the North Cross route being proposed to smash right through Dalston. This was first unveiled in 1965, scrapped in 1973. The Hackney Society was vociferous in its objection to that. And the North London Line Committee, the North London Line being our present-day Mildmay line, formed in 1970 to fight the line's closure, and the tide had turned by the late 70s, and in 1980, Hackney Central Station opened to kind of mark almost the end of the threat to the line. Many other campaigns would follow, from Stoke Newington Reservoirs down to London Fields Lido. Each of these, Hackney Society was a supporter, but not kind of at the sort of core of the campaigns in question. So if large-scale redevelopment and the threats posed by them had subsided, Hackney Society kind of changed tack at the end of the 70s, perhaps realising what could have been lost in recent years. It pivoted towards publishing books about Hackney's built environment. And its debut effort was From Tower to Tower Block. It's an architectural history of the borough, definitely sort of veering towards the popular end of the spectrum. And it's read today, it's generally quite factual, very meek, rather than particularly opinionated. Well, I really like this description of the various hardships that the buildings of Hackney had to endure in the years and decades leading up to its publication. It did also strike a note that you'll find throughout a number of the Society's subsequent publications of Hackney's built heritage being priceless and impossible to replace. And I believe we find this again in Michael Hunter's 1981 book on the Victorian villas of Hackney. And this is like a sort of step change in terms of being more sort of explicit and more positive about what the Society wanted to happen in Hackney's built environment, and particularly around its many, many Victorian houses. This was both a book designed, I think, to delight, to inform and inspire both those who lived in the houses and those who lived around them and worked around them. So it's focused both at the individual house level and at an area level as well. And the Hackney Society had been very interested in the concept of conservation areas since they were introduced under the Civic Amenities Act of 1967. Hackney's Houses was intended to be a companion work to the Victorian Villas book, and a reminder of what was good about the historic built environment. It went a stage further by actually being a sort of demonstrating through words and through images the effects of both good and bad practice in terms of work done on the fabric of older houses. And I mean, this book still sells really well today. There's the bookstores we've had at Hackney History Festival, this has been one of the kind of consistent bestsellers, and I think it's testament to the quality of the book. Change Attack in 1986 with this publication, also a change in the subject matter, industrial heritage, and response to, in some ways, a very similar issue around the threat to the existence of older buildings, but industrial buildings, and this more focused issue on South Shoreditch and in Hackney Wick, and using grant funding from the Inner City Partnership. Hackney Society in 1983 employed an archaeologist named Denny Edwards on a part-time basis to investigate the built industrial heritage of the borough. The rate of change in Hackney Wick was such that what was originally envisaged as a two-area report was slimmed down to one that focused on South Shoreditch. And it's a real tragedy that Denny Edwards died before the project was completed and the book was published. And so all this quotes, the information I'm drawing from Michael Hunter's preface to the report. It's a meticulous piece of work, bursting with information, and I think it's sort of partly aimed at a more professional audience, and also with the stated desire to inspire further work of its kind on the industrial heritage of Hackney, which unfortunately it didn't really do, at least not to anything like the same extent, but it did achieve another aim, which is to do with raising awareness and improving the planning policy protection of industrial heritage. South Shoreditch was designated as a conservation area in 1991, and this shows, I think, the success of Hackney's endeavour here, Hackney Society's endeavour, doing the legwork to provide the information to underpin decisions and changes that only could be delivered by Hackney Council. And then on to this core book of this part of my talk, Buildings at Risk in Hackney, published in 1987. It's something I haven't highlighted up until now is that Hackney experienced enduring general poverty throughout much of the 20th century, right up into the 1980s and beyond. And the lack of investment in its historic buildings was one fairly inevitable outcome of that poverty. And this report really brings out in stark detail the nature of the issue and the extent of the issue. It's based upon, I think I mentioned before, a Hackney Society survey done in 1985, 1986, and research allied to that. And in turn, that was also using a 1980 survey by Rosemary Waugh. Shows Hackney Society was doing its own in-house research as well as employing what we call consultants now, but an archaeologist such as Denny Edwards to work on its behalf. And it's not just simply collating and publishing other people's information. So Builders at Risk in Hackney was both describing the problem and the root causes. It was also a call to action. There wasn't necessarily a neat solution, as in the case of South Shoreditch and its industrial heritage. I mean, the scope was much, much broader. We're talking everything from houses and churches through to the German hospital. One thing it did do was put some numbers on the size of the problem. Unfortunately, the numbers don't match up at the start and end of the book, so it's either 150 or 160 buildings were deemed to be at risk. And that comes with the salutary comment that there are far more derelict historic buildings in Hackney than this. It employed a very broad definition of at risk based on sort of the uncertainty of the future of the building in question. We have a little tighter definition now for building at risk group of a building having to be disused, decayed, derelict, generally down on its luck, all the Ds. It employed a tripartite division for sort of categorising these buildings. It did so according to the reason for why their outlook was so gloomy. So we have the redundancy of institutional buildings, such as churches, decay of smaller buildings through lack of investment, and thirdly, and quite interestingly for what was to follow, the negative effects of a new wave of private, commercial or residential developments. And this, the mid-80s was kind of mid-Thatcher era at this point, and I think, we'll see how this pans out in due course. Elizabeth McKellar, the author of the book, was absolutely excoriating its assessment of Hackney Council's role in the situation such as existed at the time of her writing, talking of indecision, neglect and waste, even around its own buildings, and especially its own buildings. It was a major property owner within the borough and doing very little about maintaining its historic buildings. It was also slow in policy implementation, not going anywhere near as far as the extent to which planning law allowed it to go in terms of funding repairs to buildings and so forth. All of which, in McKellar's eyes, was tantamount to a demolition policy. And so she was basically unalloyed plea for appreciation and action on the council's part as both the property owner and the local planning authority, and likewise to all owners of historic buildings in the borough. Quickly to mention Lost Hackney, it was almost inevitable after all these books on buildings that were still standing, there should be one about what had been lost. Actually, this isn't quite the book that it might have been, not either as sentimental nor as pointed in apportioning blame to the council or anyone else for why buildings had been lost. And possibly this is because it takes a broader chronological remit than just the mid to late 20th century. Now, in the introduction, Robinson very helpfully name-checks some pieces of planning legislation that have seen benefits in terms of the protections according to the historic built environment. And I've managed to calendar all of them that happened since 1944. Now, you didn't pay your entrance fee to hear me going through each and every one of those, so I'll refrain from doing so and make a couple of more general points. The first being that 2/3 of these planning laws or planning policy guidances were created and passed subsequent to 1967, after the year of the foundation of the Hackney Society. And within the first 25 years, the latest date of this is 1990. So a lot had happened in quite a short space of time. And in many ways, this was planning policy catching up with what the Hackney Society had been saying ever since the late 60s. And behind this, there's also two further developments, one of which is in 1975, there's a swathe of new national listings of heritage assets in Hackney, resulting from what was called the resurvey by the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, which was begun in 1968, but took several years for Hackney's turn to come up in that. And the second was something I really learned about this week, was Hackney Society's status in local planning decisions. Relations were very frosty in the 1970s, but by the 1980s, certainly the early 80s, Hackney Society actually sat on the planning committee and had a vote in planning decisions made by the council. But unfortunately, with so many historic buildings just sat idle, with no one caring for them, that could only have a very limited effect on the in terms of what Hackney Society could do to rescue these buildings. The Tory government of the 80s curtailed these things, and so by the 90s, Hackney Society assumed its present status as a consultee, a proven and credible community voice in planning matters. And also, this led to the formation, in a roundabout way, of the Hackney Historic Buildings Trust. This enabled people within the borough to be a bit more hands-on in the saving of at-risk assets. Hackney Society wasn't at the time constituted as a charity, so all liabilities would fall on its organising committee, which, when it comes to restoring buildings, is not an ideal state of affairs. And so, using a model pioneered in Spitalfields and elsewhere, the Hackney Historic Buildings Trust was founded, and amongst the buildings saved, this one you're sat in right here and right now, but it's done several others around the borough and continues to do great work in the present day. Moving to the 90s, and a sort of drop-off in the rate of publications, and there's various ways of explaining this. It's the planning policy battle been won, what Hackney would be wanting to see happen with the borough's historic buildings, but also nationally, had been achieved, but it remained a different story still with the delivery of planning policy in the borough, and also with people and or organisations having the money to invest in the historic buildings. This was picked up in the final publication of the 20th century by the Hackney Society, looking at the 20th century buildings of the borough. It notes a revolution, no less, in regards to attitudes towards historic housing, with more investment being made in previous decades. But this was still not enough, because there's still next to no money for publicly owned heritage. So you see here a whole list of different types of public assets that just were almost going to waste. The reference below as well to the urban renaissance speaks to the urban task force of the early years of the new Labour government under the leadership of the famous architect Richard Rogers. Fast forward a few years, and Lisa Rigg, in her introduction to 40 Buildings, first published in 2009, nuanced this view, noting the impacts of regeneration funding and historic heritage lottery fund cash from the mid-90s, and actually does a great service to us by listing all the grants and recipients of those grants between 1994 and 2009. And there's a shifting landscape I think we can start to see between public sector, heritage lottery funding and so forth, and private sector investment into the borough. And sort of starts to become a bit more clear. We start to perceive the sort of the familiar names, the familiar places of gentrified, hipsterfied Hackney of the 21st century, and very much a sense, through Lisa's words, of private investment, both commercial and personal, coming to the fore in the built environment of the borough. And with this, there's a sort of exposure of Hackney's built heritage to the socio-cultural fabric of Hackney, and it's in this introduction, Lisa doesn't really mention much about what the Hackney Society is doing. That's because I think it was going through quite a fallow time. What Rigg refers to as a period of near collapse. So it's not particularly surprising that there's not a lot to report in these years. But that wasn't the case. A few years later, in what I think is Hackney Society's best book, and I see Laurie there, its editor, absolutely fantastic work. Copies available at the back. I can't begin to sort of describe how good it is, but I will describe, or I've picked a few choice quotes from it. I think Laurie, in his introduction, very much picked up where Lisa Rigg left off, in focusing on the council's role in all of this. And after a decade and a half of having a not dysfunctional council, I think you could start to see the shape of what had resulted, and not necessarily all that positive in some respects. And in particular, thing to celebrate of Laurie's essay is the more the sort of not just the built heritage, but the social history that goes with it, and the character imparted by the combination of them, and the sense that it was no longer for long-standing, unglamorous businesses just to be doing good enough. The money was coming in, and money talked, and there was a price to pay if you wanted to continue to exist as a business within Hackney at the time. It's very tricky for an entirely voluntary organisation like the Hackney Society to have particularly profound impact against these fairly profound market forces, even at the level of a single pub. But in Lisa Shell's truly fantastic chapter in Portrait of a Community, she focuses on the role of Hackney Society-supported conservation area advisory committees, and later the Hackney Society Planning Group, founded in 2010, and the impact they have through their scrutinisation of literally thousands of planning applications every year affecting buildings and spaces within the borough. And there's no better guide to the issues at hand than Lisa, an architect, as well as the chair of the planning group. So when she talks about unprecedented pressures and the shortcomings, she's not pulling her punches here, but she knows the lie of the land better than anyone. And of course, I've gone without mentioning public sector austerity imposed by the coalition government and perpetuated by all governments thereafter. There's less money for less essential public services, such as planning, than there was earlier in the 21st century. And so it's tilted the balance further away from sort of the public sector being able to kind of have its way towards those with in the private sector with greater money. And so, of course, that inevitably comes to have at least some effect upon the historic built environment. These try some very apt examples, all too apt examples of how things go wrong in this regard. But I'll leave you to read that in the book that you're all going to buy afterwards. And she lays bare the multifold negative effects of the economic circumstances brought on by the corporate heritage enemy behind major developments across the borough. Might seem quite extreme, but I'd argue not necessarily. Which brings us to the present day, or rather November 2024 and the inception of the Buildings at Risk group. We've met monthly ever since. It's the second Monday of the month, 6 to 7 p.m. on Zoom. Please do join us. It brings together ordinary citizens with planners, with elected members from the council, heritage professionals and other representatives of other organisations. Truly a sort of collaborative effort. It was established off the back of the publication of Historic England's Heritage Risk Register for 2024, which featured no fewer than 34 entries for heritage assets in Hackney Borough. These are what we all term designated heritage assets. They have weight in planning law. We also consider undesignated heritage assets, standardly locally listed buildings, but also we will consider buildings and other structures and spaces that have no form of heritage designation, but would stand a good shout of at least making locally listed status. We don't cover current planning, any building that has a current planning application relating to it, nor planning appeals. That's for the Hackney Society planning group. We wrap around their work, and I think we work pretty well in combination. You may remember I said in 1987 there was an at-risk population of about 150 or 160 buildings. By 1991, when English Heritage published its first Buildings at Risk list, there were 101 entries in Hackney, and by the time of the Heritage Risk Register's debut in 2009, this had dropped to 32. This is out of a borough total of potentially more than 500 designated heritage assets. So, the numbers obviously vary quite markedly, but that's kind of hopefully gives you some context. My own tracking of the numbers of heritage at risk register entries in the borough since 2013 shows sort of vague ups and downs, but nonetheless a sort of consistently high number. In fact, Hackney ranks year after year as one of the London boroughs with the highest number of heritage at risk register entries in London. So the narratives of massive inward investment and gentrification aren't necessarily having the impact you might expect it to have, certainly on some buildings. And we wanted as a group to understand why that was. I'll break it down for you by using the current Heritage at Risk Register, which published last November, and actually our number increased by 2. And to break that down, half of those, near enough, are churches or structures associated with churches. There's a large number of smaller private residential or commercial buildings or mixes of both. 3 publicly owned buildings, or Hackney council-owned buildings, 2 miscellaneous structures, I call them, and 2 conservation areas, the Mare Street Conservation Area and the Sun Street Conservation Area, right at the southern tip of the borough. We were advised by those in the know to be a critical friend to Hackney, to Historic England, to building owners as a group, not to sort of point fingers and apportion blame, but to be here to understand why heritage assets are deemed at risk, who's doing what, and there is always someone doing something, which is one of the things I want to impart in this talk. And pooling information, pooling contacts, and making our findings known as well to the wider public. Because be you a Hackney Society member or otherwise, it's great if people can feel more informed about things and not fear the worst. It was a natural reaction. We all do it in the absence of solid facts to kind of fear the worst about something. You see down at a building looking boarded up and sad, you expect it's just been completely neglected and abandoned, but that's not the case, never the case. So I'll quickly run you through some of our sort of fairly typical buildings that we actually look at. Start down in Hoxton at St Chad's Church, a Grade 1 listed building. It's an incredible structure. And it might look okay, but unfortunately it faces very typical issues for a historic church. Here with its brickwork, its rainwater goods, and somewhat ironically with the little spire on top, the most inaccessible part of the entire church, is one of the bits in the worst condition. Won't be a newsflash to you to learn that it's an Anglican church with a very small congregation, and one thing we learned from the parish representative was that its parish, the highest percentage in terms of a population age group, is 26 to 45 years old, which just so happens to be the lowest church attending age group of all. So big church, small congregation, big bills to pay in order to see the church restored and taken off the heritage risk register. And I have to also to say that Diocese of London time and time again comes up as something of a blocker in helping congregations and parishes actually push forward with stuff. They sit on, in this case, a quinquennial inspection report, which would be useful to have the information to sort of plan as a parish for how to fundraise. But that's a frustration that I think will hopefully in time ease. The Shrubland Road Evangelical or Site of Eternal Life Church in London Fields is, by contrast, a church that has been used by a sizable and active evangelical congregation. Unfortunately, the building isn't owned by them. It's in private ownership, and those private owners are trying to sell the building for something like £3 million without inevitably having much success in that. It's a very rare, a very early example, certainly, of a temporary iron mission church, now clad in corrugated asbestos sheeting, lovely, and it's being squatted currently. And squatters aren't necessarily the issue. It's very much depends case by case, but what we have to say is this is very much a building not designed to be occupied as a domestic residence. So there's clearly issues around that which both us and the local community are concerned about. Another one you may be familiar with is the old church up in Stoke Newington, the oldest complete church in the borough, still owned by the Anglican parish, despite the new massive church being built across the road in the later 19th century. It's leased out as a music venue and performance space, and you may be aware of the present fundraising efforts to replace the Victorian piping serving the toilets inside the church. That's not the reason why it's on the heritage risk register. There's issues with damp in the walls, worsening structural movement of the ceiling, and outside the crumbling remains of the north aisle, which was built in the early 19th century, all but destroyed in World War II. So multifold issues here, and that's before mentioning the churchyard more generally. Again, we have crumbling tombstones, and one of the issues we have here with with both, same for church and churchyard alike, is that we have multiple partners, like all kind of with an interest, but without kind of working together to kind of have concerted action in order to find solutions to these things. It's really frustrating that we can't get so much further. Haggerston Baths, shut in 2000. It's been multiple regeneration projects have been proposed, been advanced to various stages, but never very far, and all have come to nothing. So currently, we as taxpayers are paying something like £300,000 for it to be preserved in a mothballed state. Millions of pounds will be needed to restore it, and unfortunately, the future doesn't look very bright for that, but I'll come back to that in a second. Disinfecting station, Millfields Road in Lower Clapton. It's marginally better news. We think we've got some forward movement on this now, following it becoming one of the Victorian Society's top 10, really rather awful top 10 endangered buildings list for 2026. So it's given a new public profile it didn't have before. It's a very complex site, fascinating, unique in its preservation site. So the Caretaker's Lodge is in great nick. It's home to our video partners WorldRight. Please go to their thing on the 23rd of May and actually see inside the building, as well as see all the great work that WorldRight do. Whereas the building in the middle there, disinfecting station itself, is partly roofless, yet has much original equipment from its time, disinfecting people's bodies and people's possessions at the start of the 20th century. And the shelter house is kind of in between state, all of which means it needs, it's a unique site that needs a unique solution for its regeneration. And hopefully the Victorian Society's intervention is going to prove impactful. There's possibility that Hackney Historic Buildings Trust may get involved in some capacity in the near future. Final example, this Stoke Newington Municipal Buildings, huge 1930 civic building, was restored in the early 21st century, only the roof started leaking not long after, and that's rendered large parts of the building unusable. The council has very slowly but steadily been working on a refurbishment project that's eventually leased out to a private operator and operated as some mixed-use venue. That work would cost millions and millions of pounds. So it needs a big project, lots of planning beforehand, as well as budgetary approval. So all of which means it's moving forward very, very slowly. You may have, if you walked past, you may have seen some work's being done on it. That's separate to the work being done at present on the library next door. But one thing I think is that there should be some point sort of community input into what happens to the building in order that it's just a kind of imposed upon Stoke Newington community. Like, what does Stoke Newington need from a refurbished town hall? So the future, and just to skip through a huge amount of stuff because I'm completely misjudged this, but it's going to be fine. We've done recording projects. I've given guided tours. We're doing one on the 5th of September down in Shoreditch, looking at the heritage at risk, past and present, and also some archaeology and some new design, all of rolled into one. Fantastic way to spend your morning. Also going to do a project on the historic street furniture of the borough that currently has no form of listed protection. And lastly, the past, present and future of Haggerston Bards. I mentioned it not so long ago, and what we want to do as the Hackney Society is just a twofold thing, really. Inform people of all that's gone on with the Bards, right from its construction at the start of the 20th century to its closure, and then everything that has and hasn't happened in the quarter of a century since, and ask people, what do you want from Haggerston Bards to the future? If and when it's reopened, what community facilities do you want to see in there? The last project that asked those questions over a decade ago. And so I think it's high time, in all that's gone on in the world in the past 10 years or so, to ask the question, what do we want from Haggerston Bards as it sits in the middle of its community and the wider borough? So there we go. The conclusions I've borrowed wholesale from the late, great Nick Perry, which I think, still, this was writing around 2017. I think these are still the same issues that we face today in the borough. But I think we're in a better place now. Hackney Society is just growing and growing in its members, growing in its diversity of the activities it's putting on. And I think that this has come at a good time. Seen several phases of the society, various peaks and troughs of its activities and its particular folk, and I think we're entering a new era, and all thanks to Janet Chapman, really, just being a fantastic chair who's just says yes to a lot of things and gets manages to get other people to come along with her. And we've achieved a lot already, and we're only just started. And I think, when we have a council that's sort of facing ongoing austerity and so can only do so much with so much money, you have developers and so forth who now have almost, it feels like a government on its side. The changes to national planning policy framework mean that previous equilibrium between economic, social and environmental constraints, and idea we should kind of have them all balanced out, being very much tipped in favour of the economic, get that GDP growing through building anything, and will remove the constraints doing so. I think as a community, some of those constraints work in our favour, and I think therefore that if we as a voluntary member organisation can come together and say, we as a community are interested in that, we care about that, we want to see this happen, then I think that should stand us in a better stead. Want more ambitious and more imaginative and above more and more active society. That's what I think we're well on the way to doing. So if you're not a member, please join us, and thanks ever so much for listening.
Thanks very much, Rob. Questions?
I may be mistaken, but I thought that St Chad's Church in Dunlow Street had a lot of solar panels. Is that its roof, or was it a neighbouring church? No.
I don't know. It may be around the other side. That would face south, so that would make quite a lot of sense. It's West Hackney Church, St Paul's. I think it does actually feed into quite a big issue around, there's a lot of strong preservation thrust to a lot of, particularly planning side of stuff with the historic built environments. What do we want to say? We have conservation areas that are very meticulous about maintaining their buildings as they were looked in the 18th or 19th centuries, yet we have tarmacked roads and tarmac pavements and cars parked outside and parking ticket machines. Where do you draw the line? I think, in the future, if we have a, warming climate, we need to get more renewables. Why can't we put solar panels on the roofs of historic buildings? Why can't we put double glazing in instead of single glazed sash windows? It's possible. I think maybe where you your red lines may just have to change over time, but case by case basis, I should add, is always the best way to go.
Okay, we got a question over this side.
Oh, yeah.
Hi. Question is there any correlation between sort of dangerous structures in the borough to sort of buildings at risk?
When you say dangerous structure, in terms of ones that are about to...
That have got dangerous structure notices.
I thought about this the other day, actually. I think the buildings are on the heritage risk register. The disinfecting station's the one that's disintegrated the most. And so it's in a council yard. You can't get anywhere near it. There's also a second line of fencing as if to further dissuade you. But most are actually, they've got their roofs, they've got their windows, they may be boarded up, have the sort of metal grills over. So, yeah, it's probably ones that don't have any form of listed status that may actually be in the worst condition. There's not many. You go around all different parts of the borough. It's quite rare now to see a really dilapidated building. And so I'd say, yeah, whatever the situation was in sort of the 70s, 80s, 90s, we're in a very different position now. And some of the world have just been demolished. But others, yeah, I think have been restored, given a new lease of life. And so I think, yeah, it's quite unusual. And certainly from off the top of my head right now, I can't think of any that is, in a really parlous state that has actually one I didn't show you. There's one in Stoke Newington Church Street at 175 that has a big structural prop on the front. It's the old John's Garden Centre, if you know it. And that has had to have this incredible prop just to keep the front wall from collapsing. So, yeah, but they've got the money and the kit to do that. So I think, yeah, it's quite a rare sight.
A big round of applause for Rob, I think.